Sure.
All right, looks like we have a full room. I'm so glad to see everyone. My name is Dan Caraca. I'm the coordinator for the annual country study program, which nobody knows what that is because it's a mouthful, but it's better well known as the Year of program. And so last year was the Year of Morocco. Anybody hear about the Year of Morocco last year? You? Okay, good. And next year will be the Year of Greece. This year's the Year of Cuba, obviously. And we have a whole great lineup of different speakers and programs. There's a fantastic art exhibit, one floor up. If you haven't been, you should definitely go. It's going to be open until January, but it's a beautiful exhibit. It's right above us. And it features 40 different artists from Cuba, their artwork. It's a very diverse collection of art. It's just fantastic. We will have a study abroad program to Cuba. I'm one of the faculty leading that program. I'm happy to talk more about it. Most of you got a flyer about it as you came in the door. Make sure that you complete your evaluation of this program and turn it into me at the back as you're leaving. Next week, we have a really incredible lineup. So this is not on the flyer with the list of all the programs. It says something like, who's got a schedule of all the programs?
I don't know whether it works or not.
Oh.
It says something like, week of October 7th to 10th.
I've had
Cuban
these
journalists
before,
and
but if you
independent
wanna try it,
media residency. So
just
these
go
two
there.
journalists, Jose Nieves and Elaine Rodriguez, they are both owners of independent newspapers in Cuba.
It's worth it.
Probably
Yep.
nobody would
Works.
ever be able to say independent journalist in Cuba until fairly recently. So what they're doing is very courageous. It's very, they're real change agents in Cuba, and they're going to be speaking every day next week. So if you're interested in hearing directly from two people from Cuba about journalism in Cuba, I have just one copy of the full schedule. It'll be on the website if it's not already there, so you can see each day what's happening next week. But I'll have it at the back of the room as well. Professor Alan Lebaron is our speaker today. It's always fantastic when we can highlight one of our own KSU faculty in our Year of series. And Professor Lebaron has been thinking about and teaching about Cuba for longer than I've been here at Kennesaw, maybe a lot longer. So he's somebody who's really been a student of Cuba for a very, very long time and has been sharing his knowledge with KSU students for a very long time. He's professor of Latin American history, and he's director of the Maya Heritage Community Project, which is based in Canton, I would say, but is all over the nation, right? I mean, you're traveling all the time to meet with different Mayan communities all over
Right.
the United States and in Central America.
Right. We are international these days.
And elsewhere. He is managing editor of the Maya America Journal of Essays, Commentary, and Analysis. He's past president of the Southeast World History Association and the Georgia Association of Historians. And he's organized or helped organize 14 national conferences. And he's been awarded a Distinguished Professor Service Award and a Georgia Consortium for International Studies Senior Faculty Internationalization Award. And his PhD in Latin American history is from the University of Florida. And I won't say what year that was. No, but join me in thanking Dr. LeBaron for sharing his expertise with us.
And I think my class, who probably have seen a few of these slides before. I am trying something different. That is, I'm trying to bring in a little bit of my personal story. I used to do that a lot with some of my classes back in the old days, but now it seems so long ago I've gotten away from talking about some of my experiences. But the way I approach it today is I want to show what a dilemma working with Central America can be, working with Latin America. That is, being from the United States, being a privileged person living in a great, powerful nation. It brings up a lot of dilemmas over time. So I just wanted to pepper an overview of this region and United States policy, and then reveal to you that a lot of the way I feel and think has been very influenced over many years. And the people I know, the people I met, the people I work with, have had a strong hand in the way I feel, of course. So just to flow through some things, Columbus, we know, came to the Americas looking for a route to Asia, pretty much following the patterns of the winds and the ocean currents. And they hit and began to develop a stronghold in what is today considered Central America and the Caribbean. The Caribbean was first, and the Spanish brought in their government, their military, their horses, their dogs, their weapons, and they developed a beachhead there with it, which they could then go out and conquer and spread out and develop an empire from there. What they found was a large number, about 30 million in this area, Mesoamerica, Central America, 30 million Native Americans who had large cities and high organization, the great empire of the Aztec, the classical civilization of the Maya. We're only now discovering that what we once knew was hundreds, even thousands of cities that they had are now even much more than once thought and more highly populated. The Spanish came here for a reason. They came because they're looking for Asia first, but they settled in these regions because they had tens of millions of people that they could conquer. And they did, and that became their labor source. They also had lots of silver and other precious minerals, which they found and they claimed. They didn't bother with the areas that would later become the United States because they didn't have the number of workers available or the organization through the civilizations nor the precious metals. What they built up in the area called New Spain looks like this. They also had an empire which stretched all the way to the bottom, but you see this is well into the area of the United States. I started my travels in 1972. I'll admit the date. I was an undergraduate at Boise State University, and someone who I was working with in a local pizza parlor had just graduated and wanted to get a bunch of film or slides that he could then take to his classrooms. He was going to be a teacher and was asking for someone to go along with him. I agreed, and we went from Boise, driving through the United States, Mexico, and into Central America, Honduras, and back, driving in a pickup with a camper on the back. It was a 2.5-month summer road trip. Guatemala made the biggest impression on me, however. I was amazed by most of what I saw. I'd only known Mexico as a concept from maybe cowboy movies and such, which had your banditos and your cactus and a few things like that. But I was amazed that the further we got down into Mexico, how beautiful it was, how grand it was, how much of a Native American presence was there, how much of a colonial Spain presence was there. And that extended on into Central America. But Guatemala, so intensely green and beautiful. High mountains, lots of volcanoes which stand up with the cone cups into the blue sky. And the Maya villages, many of the people still today speaking their languages and wearing their beautiful woven clothes, but even more so in 1972. The area was much more isolated into the Maya villages. Very few of the roads were there. And of course, the temples, the ancient temples of the classical Maya, like this. I saw this land in 1972. We had to drive overland, and there were only a few areas that were available. It was just an archaeological site at that time. Now it is a World Heritage Center and gets hundreds of thousands of people every year going in there. And they've uncovered many more temples. I'm standing on a temple here, one of the highest, taking these out. The first time I was here, I camped out a couple of nights in that room there at the top. And it seems it is not as tall as the one I'm standing on here to take the photo, but from that position, I could look down and see some beautiful jungle birds flying beneath me, like 15 feet beneath me, looking down. And then way, way down, you see the anteaters and the other animals scurrying around below in the plaza. This place is still beautiful to see. I've taken students there a number of times over the years. They're full of monkeys, full of lots of different kinds of animals, wild turkeys, jaguars if you're lucky enough to, or unlucky enough to run into one. I did not consider at the time myself as a part of a colonial power or an extension of imperial power. But even though we traveled in very rough circumstances with very little money, lots of times running into problems, having to stop along the way and blow out the carburetor and get the car running again. But we had the security of the United States behind us. We had a home. We were attached to something that was waiting for us. I discovered then, because I continued to work with Central America after that and Guatemala, that the themes of national security and imperialism, they are the central concepts that one has to come to grips with. The United States did not start without a plan. The grand design of the United States has been to expand and to gain power. From the 13 colonies, by 1848, the United States had taken the top half of Mexico. In a war where the United States had to go down and actually occupy for a while Mexico City. The fighting was intense, and it's something that we hardly learn about in our US schools, but something that is very, very understood inside of Latin America. But the United States, once it hit sea to shining sea, does not stop. It continues its journey in competition with the other imperial powers directly out into the Pacific Ocean. Still on the voyage, you might say, of Columbus, who was on the way to Asia to develop trading with there, and also to the south. You see, these are just examples of United States occupation in the area. Hawaii Islands is one of the places that the United States took, annexed, and generally it's not given away. I mean, most places fight tooth and nail to keep it, but it is an imperial design to take it and to develop this commercial military network, which brings in not only the power of the United States, but one could argue the national security of the United States, because it's a very competitive world. In fact, if you look at a bigger picture, here's Central America again, Mexico, you see the many places where the United States has been involved time after time. This cartoon is kind of cool. It starts out with the United States as rather a baby, innocent like a baby, growing up into a young man, getting stronger as the United States expands. 1898, the war with Spain. And finally, by the end of the century, the United States becomes a strong military power, secures its wealth and national security, ensures that the European powers or an expanding Japan or other areas are not going to take the lands that could have or should have belonged to the United States. However, you see that the person who drew this understands that there's also greed and corruption involved in the well-rotund Uncle Sam. And here, on the other hand, on the other side, we have the other powers that are reaching out hands of respect and acceptance and welcoming the United States to the imperial club. Ultimate security for the United States. You may have all have heard of this, but in the time period that we're talking about, the turn of the century and into the beginning of the 20th century, it was not something to be ashamed about, to be imperialistic. In fact, it was something more to be proud of, because all great nations considered imperialism, expansion, development of power and wealth to be vital, to be required. And going into the area which had been Spain's, there was a lot of instability. Since Spain had been thrown out after 300 years of colonialism, the Latin American governments had not developed an internal infrastructure, had not developed a self-rule, had not been allowed to. So, for example, when Mexico and Central America gained their independence in 1821, there was a great political vacuum. No one really had legitimate power. Plus, there was little money. The wars of independence fought were brutal. They were much more devastating, much more destructive than, say, the American wars of independence toward Great Britain. So what we had in Central America and Mexico were nations that were bankrupt, had no money coming in, had no political legitimacy, and fell into constant internal war, civil war, chaos. And in that, places like Europe in the 1900s, and then increasingly the United States, tried to invest, tried to engage with the natural resources. It was considered vital to the United States security that they take care of the soft underbelly. That area of the Caribbean and Central America had been an area of contention for hundreds of years. Spain went there first, they took it first, but they were soon in competition with the other European powers as well. And the United States, once it filled out its borders from east to west, especially once that gold was discovered in California and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution took place in the United States, it had to have a way in which to get to the East Coast to the West Coast securely and hopefully with prosperity. So eventually, after some years, after 1972, actually I went back to Boise State after traveling there, and I wrote a research paper for my Latin American history class about the United States involvement in Guatemala in the Guatemalan Civil War, or not Civil War, the Guatemalan Revolution of 1944 to 1954. In 1954, the Guatemalans overthrew a dictator, Jorge Ubico, who'd been there for a number of decades, had been put in with United States help, had been supported by the United States. The whole pattern of economic wealth was heavily tilted toward the hands of the United States. And I wanted to know if the United States CIA involvement in the overthrow of that government in 1954, was it legitimate? Was it justified? Could we say that the United States had a good reason to go into Guatemala in 1954? Certainly the United States said they had a good reason. Or was it like the Guatemalan revolutionaries that I talked to, the many people that I interviewed for my PhD and afterwards, who had been a part of that revolution? They said that it was a pure act of imperialism. So I wanted to know, for that paper that I wrote at Boise State back in, say, 1973, if the United States government had actually been imperialistic or had it been protecting its national security. By the time I finished the paper, I really didn't know. Actually, there were not a lot of sources in those days that one could pull on, but I still was intrigued by it, and I eventually did my PhD dissertation on the topic. In 1954, US companies dominated Guatemala's economy. I was told by the ex-president of Guatemala that he had firm evidence, he thought, that United States companies had been very involved in directly financing the opposition to his government. Certainly the US government and US businesses worked hand in hand in this famous example of US intervention. This is during the time period of Ike Eisenhower, and the president that was overthrown is the name of Jacobo Arbenz. The reputation for Guatemala at the time was being a banana republic. The company that owned so much of Guatemalan land was the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company also owned half of the US-owned railroad, the only railroad there, the only way that you could get coffee or other things to the port. UFCO, the United Fruit Company, also owned the port's facilities themselves and the ships that could move the property back and forth. So several times when the government, this was even from the 1940s, that the government of the revolution tried to bring in some measure of land reform or labor reform, or tried to pull back some of the power of the US-owned corporations and diversify the economy so that Guatemalans could own part of the pie, UFCO would just slow down or stop the train schedules. It would choke off the economy of Guatemala. The question would be, at this point, I could ask, why was it a banana republic? Yes, it's a politically unstable country, well, for the dictator, but underneath lots of turmoil. The export of a limited resource, yes, fruits, minerals, usually features a class-based society, very much so, with a large impoverished working class. This is not an industrialized country. It is one that's still agricultural for the most part, and most people are living in subsistence economies. The Ubico government had laws in which you couldn't even escape work. You couldn't even escape back to your home and just land on your ground. You may have to be picked up and put into a work gang occasionally to benefit the wealthy. But why was that true? Was it true because of the internal Central American problems, or was it true because by that time the United States had constantly put back in dictators and kept change from happening? Actually, in lots of places, if you looked at it, and I saw this when I was traveling down there too, and the many times I've stayed, I met people that are in the upper class, I met people in the middle class. They can be very gracious, very wonderful culture. The nightlife in major cities can be luxurious. These are some things of Havana, by the way, in the 50s, gambling wide open. But this kind of prosperity for certain classes would have been as well in Guatemala City or in Managua in Nicaragua, throughout the area. And much of it was connected to or fueled by U.S. businesses. Back to Guatemala for a minute, though. This is almost hard to believe, I think, in the context of our own time period, how intricately tied together the U.S. government was with the United Fruit Company. The Secretary of State had been a central person in the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, which worked with the United Fruit Company. Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, was on the board of directors of the United Fruit Company and a big shareholder of the United Fruit Company. The public relations officer, one of the spearheading people in the campaign against Guatemala, which named Guatemala as a communist threat to the United States at that time period in the early 50s, Ed Whitman was the husband of the personal secretary of Eisenhower. This person, Ann Whitman, had worked in the campaign for the presidential election and then went to the White House and served all 8 years of the Eisenhower administration. All very much a single family. So was it for national security? Did it have to happen? I'm not going to go through all the details to you. I just want to pose some questions to you. So getting back on a track to a personal story. By the time 1980 came, I'd finished a master's. I did my master's on Guatemala as well. And before that, actually I ended up living in Japan for a while. And Japan was such a safe country, it still is. Safe, reasonable, trains run on time, people are polite, there's no revolutionaries, no fighting, no guns. And I struggled whether I should go back to Central America. I'm thinking, why should I spend my life studying these kinds of places? I almost didn't go. I was very close to just closing down. I think partly it was stubbornness that I'd had a master's. Maybe I should go back and get a PhD. It wasn't a good reason for that regard. But I also was curious. I still had the curiosity. How deeply was the United States' actions in the world imperialistic? To what degree of it was justifiable or unavoidable? So in 1980, I decided to continue in graduate school, but I decided I would go to Guatemala. I thought, why, if I study Guatemala, why would I go to a university in the United States to study Guatemala? I should study in the horse's mouth. I would go to Guatemala, to the Universidad de San Carlos, the major State University in Guatemala. But just in 1980, just as I was arriving, violence broke out. It had been breaking out for a few years in the countryside of Guatemala. The U.S., or not U.S. military, but the Guatemalan military, backed by the United States, had been moving into the countryside and wiping out some Maya villages. Then it came into the city itself, and a number of professors and students had been assassinated. Others were disappeared. Some of them then ran off to Mexico or other friendly places. And since my topic was revolution, I thought maybe it wasn't the best place for me to stay. I went to Nicaragua instead, 1 year after the Sandinista Revolution of 1979. All of these places have similar patterns, similar stories of the U.S. government stepping in to ex-Spanish colonial areas, taking advantage of the weak economies, the chaotic politics, and establishing wealthy businesses. The US-backed dictator at that time had owned about half of Guatemalan wealth, according to most of the data. I'll just read you a couple of things of my experience in Nicaragua in a moment. But I come to the conclusion that based on the people I've known, the many people I've talked to in the upper parts of the revolutionary forces and the people themselves, this stretches across the region. It seems so possible to me that if the United States had been less pushy, less domineering, less imperialistic, they could have co-opted many of the people. After all, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, in other places, when you would talk to people, they would tell you that they admired the democracy in the United States. They admired the way of life in the United States. In fact, they wanted to emulate the United States in most every respect. But you could not emulate, say, coming from Nicaragua or Guatemala, the United States from night to day, because the United States has built itself up over centuries. These areas were still struggling to pull themselves out of a neo-colonial past. But they wanted to be friends. Also, you think of Cuba and some other places. Cuba's just 90 miles off the border of the United States. All these other areas are also extremely close to the United States. Their natural markets are with the United States. They had no logical reason to try to pick up markets in the Soviet Union or elsewhere. They had a natural market connection to the network, to the infrastructure of the United States. But rather than working with them and allowing them to make changes in their infrastructure, for example, land reform, which was desperately needed, they instead worked against reform and worked to keep the neo-colonial structure. I don't know, maybe just I had a memoir about Guatemala, and that's where I got my title, because the people I lived with down there for a while would tell me that Cuba is a good country, and Cuba was the one that was helping Nicaragua survive. When I first went to Nicaragua in 1980, I hadn't planned to go. I didn't know anybody there. I just dropped in, and that was because I had, as I told you, I'd wanted to go to Guatemala. I'd planned to go to Guatemala. I'd made arrangements to study at the university in Guatemala. Since that was taken away from me, since I didn't want to risk my life by going there where people were being killed, I ended up in Guatemala, or Nicaragua, which was still just recovering from its revolution. When I was first there, I first met a lot of people that were against the Sandinistas, or against the revolution. I naturally met in with the middle class. I went to the U.S. Embassy. I talked to them. I talked to the ambassador there, or actually not the ambassador, just below the ambassador. And I remember him telling me that I shouldn't stay in Nicaragua, that things were probably going to get hot, that there were a bunch of socialists, things would go wrong. And he also admitted to me after a while, after a beer or two, that he didn't like Nicaragua. He thought it was a backward country. He wanted to get out of there. I thought, this is not a good way to start making friends if you already don't like the place. But I ended up living with a family that was very pro-Sandinista. And through them, I met many other people in the neighborhood. They were in a lower middle class neighborhood. They had a car that was a really old car. They had a wire that you could hold the door closed with, and constantly working on it to get it to move day by day. But they were relatively comfortable. They were urbanized. They lived in Managua, in the capital, in the city, that is, and not a peasant, therefore. This family had a bunch of young people. So I just wrote a couple of things, and I'll share them with you because I said it was going to be a personal journey, so I'll read a couple very quickly. This one was a member of a militia, and I kind of built up. After Somoza, the dictator's defeat, Nicaragua conducted a strong military buildup under the Sandinistas with the help of Soviet material. Remember, this is 1979. In Guatemala, 1944 to 1954, they stayed at arm's length. They stayed away from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was really not very active inside the Americas. And they tried everything vis-a-vis the United States by themselves within the revolution. They did not seek outside help. The United States wouldn't have let them anyway, but they did not seek outside help. Only with Cuba managing to obtain the outside help of the Soviet Union, did the Sandinistas then in 1979 have a lot of help from Cuba for the fighting and to establish the government afterward, and because of the connection to the Soviet Union. So there was connections to the Soviet Union and to Cuba in Nicaragua, which of course made the United States very suspicious to it. But I also met again and again people that said that they only were doing this because they had no choice, that they were doing this because they knew from the case in Guatemala and in the case in Nicaragua, the United States would not let them achieve a reformed government. One of the people is saying, when I approached the idea that maybe the United States was just making some honest mistakes, that they were trying to do the best thing, as was a popular way of thinking in a lot of the literature at that time, she said, well, that's ridiculous, because America backed the rich and put in Somoza, the dictator, long before Marxism became popular. Few people in Nicaragua are even communists now, and I think that's true among the people. Communist was a concept, a political theory that they really didn't know much about. They just wanted to live a reasonable life. You Americans might be fooled by those who control your country, but we are not. The fact is, your country wants to destroy us, and for its own selfish reasons. This is interesting what she said. America backed the rich and put in Somoza long before Marxism became popular. This is one of the questions we have about the United States, who looks at Central America in the 50s and says, well, there's a Marxist movement, there's a Cold War, but it's not different from the pattern of the United States and Guatemala from the 1800s. Long before Marxism was known or talked about, or before socialism was an ideal, the United States had a similar pattern of imperialistic actions. Yeah, I said, anyway, if a counter-revolution does come, so everybody was talking about this in 1980, 81, they're expecting the invasions from the United States, which eventually came. I hope you won't forfeit your life fighting, I said, if it's impossible to win. You're awful young to die. She was 17. Her face darkened with disdain, and she replied in the hardest tone that her young girl voice could, we young people will never stop defending Nicaragua. We young people are prepared to die. But I don't hope to die if it can be avoided. There's much to do. Nicaragua needs much. The Somocistas are still a danger. I want to devote myself to agriculture in the countryside, to build up the country. You know, I once spent 5 months in the countryside with other high school students to help in the national crusade to educate the people under the Sandinistas when they came in. We learned about the earth and farming, about the lives of the country people, and at the same time we helped them gain some basic education. If you learned about Cuba, this is their policy in much of Latin America, and it was brought to Nicaragua. She thought it was wonderful. She saw the benefits of it, and Cuba was a good country. It was a fantastic time for me, for us. We learned that it is possible to help, and that by working with our hearts and hands, we can make a new Nicaragua. And that's what I heard again and again, just people talking about the new Nicaragua. There was so much hope. There was so much enthusiasm among the people at a wide range. And it all came to naught because the United States began to back the ex-National Guard, which eventually didn't completely overthrow the place, but had a lot to do with the destruction of the government. Now we look at the government and say, look, it's no good, but it's no good because we ruined it, as we constantly do. Just 2 more minutes. As Dan said, I work with the Maya Project, Maya Heritage Community College at Kennesaw. I work with Maya migrants, Maya immigrants to the United States, around the United States and in Guatemala. These are other people that influence me. These people we often think of as immigrants or aliens, illegal aliens, or other words being used, but so many of them are actually displaced. I prefer to see them as displaced persons because that's what they are. In the case of Guatemala, for example, the first thing that has ravaged their governments and destroyed their movements toward reform in the past has been the US government and business. The other one is the transnational drug crime and climate change. Here inside of Guatemala is the dry corridor. They are being hit hard by climate change. Many of the people can no longer grow things or grow enough things. Their coffee farms are being destroyed. And of course we know that it's not just the United States, but it is the wealthier countries that cause most of the climate damage. Also, it is the United States, Basic Economics 101, that is the demand location for drugs. Demand and supply. If you have a demand, you have supply. And a tremendous amount of drugs is consumed in the United States. And these areas are poor, they're vulnerable, they're right on the borderland, and they become the point of passage. As the United States put down the drug markets inside of Colombia, pushed them down in Mexico somewhat, they pop up like a whack-a-mole in other areas, in the Caribbean and Guatemala. So with the US government destruction or reform movements over decades, with climate change hitting them, which comes out of the sky, which they have not done, they're farmers, and then with the drugs, especially the drugs, One of the things that we don't even talk about in the United States when it deals with immigration, but it is a hand-in-hand thing. They are coming here largely because we are taking drugs. I would say that's top reason. $7 billion business just in the drugs out of Guatemala in 1 year, 2018. I can't even imagine what 1,400 metric tons of cocaine looks like. In my program, we work with graduate students, other Maya around the United States. These are both citizens of the Maya. Many of the Mayans are citizens. Many of them have been born in the United States. She's born in Los Angeles. Family here in the Canton region that I knew for some 10 years. They were trying to get permission to stay here, refugee status. They were denied. They're back in Guatemala. They went willingly. Well, part of the story is that we don't hear is that many people do go back willingly. After they apply for asylum, if they don't get it, they go back. More of them go back willingly than don't go back. But that's starting to change a little bit with the total mess of the land, with the dry land. If they have no land that they can grow on when they go back, they're more inclined to stay. Or if they're afraid to go back because of the drug gangs and they don't want their children being caught, killed, or raped, or forced into the gang, they prefer to stay here, even though they may be doing so without permission. These are all young citizens born in the United States. Another group we work with, Alamos, Colorado. A young woman in Los Angeles. Her parents are highly committed Maya priests. The Maya are an ancient people. They still speak Maya languages. There are 21 official languages that are considered Maya in the Maya family in Guatemala. And generally, when you go into a Maya priest house, they will have a little ceremony for you. They'll burn some candles. You take some smoke, the holy smoke, and cleanse yourself. My last slide. I generally have one message about the Americas. We are part of a region. We are not separate nations. We are one region. That is inescapably because we depend on each other. Perhaps the Maya struggles for survival in the United States should remind us that we share three grand epics. We are all part of the Native American world. Before Columbus came here, there were about 100 million Native American peoples from the top of Canada to the bottom of Patagonia. Many of them are still here. They are still oppressed. That's not only in the United States, but it's everywhere. It's in Guatemala. About half the people in Guatemala are Native American. We also share centuries of colonialism. We are all colonized by the European forces everywhere in the Americas. And we're still struggling to overcome those long centuries of colonialism. In the United States, it was a lot easier because there was less colonialism, less wealth. They didn't have the gold and silver and the tens of millions of Native American people that built such a strong empire that then became locked into place. Thank you, that's all. Do you have questions? Yes?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious to know that technological advances played in triggering mass migration out of the rural countryside by the indigenous peoples throughout Latin America into their major cities, and in particular their capitals. I've studied that advent of radio and TV somehow managed to get into the deepest areas of the jungle. And when young people in the
Mhm.
And their rules were extremely hostile to the poor, making it very difficult for them to succeed. There's this very famous economist from Peru named Hernando de Soto, who launched an extensive multi-year study of why poor countries have remained poor despite all of the economic aid they have received since the end of World War II. That no matter how much money is funneled into any one of these countries, they don't prosper, the middle class doesn't grow and expand, and the problem of poverty seems to just persist and not getting any better. And his studies indicate that it's the lack of reform of the legal system that keeps the poor in these countries. For instance, when he went to Peru, his home country, he embarked on a study to find out what was involved in setting up a simple garment workshop in the outskirts of Lima. And then his team went about, collecting application forms, filling them out, waiting to get approvals and stamps, and then taking it to the next level to get
Well,
the next wave of payments.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of complexities, it's
Yeah,
true.
yeah, but
I mean, there's almost so many complexities that it takes almost a lifetime. And that's really where I'm presenting the idea of a concept and a question, which I think is important for all of us. Where is the dividing line between imperialism and reform? And imperialism is internal imperialism as well, as you're pointing out, the class system, the legal system. So certainly technology. I know I first saw in some of the Maya villages in maybe about 1993 or 4, I first saw television in one television in the community house. But yeah, lots of complexities.
If I could ask a question before everyone leaves.
Yeah.
So really the examples you've given of Guatemala and Nicaragua, most of that history is shared with Cuba.
Yes,
Cuba experienced very similar kinds of processes.
that's right.
And
Very similar process, and United States involvement, United States domination. It's really is a pattern. Yes.
And so Cuba was, and the U.S. had put up this wall between each other, and
Right.
and so Cuba was able to advance and develop itself in its own way,
Yeah.
but not with the advantages of partnering with the wealthy United States.
Yeah.
And I guess you said that a lot of the people that you talked to saw Cuba as a good country, as an example.
Right.
And I don't really know if there's a question here. I'm trying to figure out what the question is, but maybe you can just say a few more words about that.
We speculated in
What
my
impact
class.
What impact did Cuba have ultimately in Nicaragua, Guatemala, or in
Yeah.
this?
I'll defer to one of my very good students here, Stephen.
Guatemala's revolution and what occurred with Guatemala's very noble attempts to reform its government and to model itself and to progress to be like the United States and to achieve wealth, justice for the underclass that was being so ignored. The United States, as we learned in our class, squashed that attempt.
Mm-hmm.
So Cuba, when it has its revolution and it makes its attempt, this taste of Guatemala's attempt to reform, attempt to resolve, and the vehement opposition that was presented by the United States towards it causes Cuba to take more and very necessary drastic measures, and revolutionary measures
Right.
to achieve what their revolution is meant to achieve.
Right. Yes. Yeah, direct correlation. And we speculated that maybe if the United States had been different, if Eisenhower had received him instead of refusing to see him and go off and play golf, and having Castro instead have his interview with Richard Nixon, it could have been different. We could have co-opted him, but they very definitely learned from one another, didn't they? And one famous name that you probably maybe know if you've been catching up with Cuba is Che Guevara, who was, of course, a central figure in the Cuban Revolution. He was there in Guatemala himself in 1954 at the time of the overthrow. And he carried that message too to Castro. We learned in Guatemala that you can't pussyfoot around with the United States. And so, yeah.
My question has to deal with the creation of a modern nation state. The United States coming out of its colonial period, you had 13 semi-independent states that decided to put together their pool of resources, put aside their interests to form a confederacy that would later become these United States.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the choices and the political circumstances in Central America where you have a fragmentation of multiple nations, if it would be better served and more successful if those nations pulled together.
Yeah, it probably would be, and they tried it. They tried it. It only lasted for about a year and a half. That part of the political vacuum, that inability to agree with each other, fighting over scarce resources. They often had hopes and plans. The president, Juan Jose Arevalo, that I interviewed for my PhD a couple times, he tried for years to get together another common structure in Central America, but it failed. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody.